Stanford University.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this nice introduction. It's nice to be back here. I've actually started to write this book 2 years ago when I had a sabbatical here for 3 months at the Woods Institute. So it's a wonderful opportunity to get back here and show what came out of all that work. The book is basically the story about how to deal with climate change, how to prevent it. And it covers the whole range of course, summarizing what the problem really is, and then from emissions to questions about how you control this problem, which is essentially a long-term problem, and where to draw the line, and how much climate change is really acceptable, and where are limits of dealing with it. And it puts, and that's a theme that is very much central to the book. It puts it in the perspective of development, economic growth, socio-economic issues as the fundamental issue, which is the cause of climate change, and which is also affected by it. And I think that's and I'll come back to that later on, it's very important to look at climate change through the lens of development objectives, economic objectives, because only then there's a chance we can really come to grips with it. The book, of course, deals with all of the relevant economic sectors and what are the options of moving to a low-carbon economy in energy supply, in transportation, in buildings, in industry, and waste. And certainly also, this is an energy seminar series, so I won't spend much time on this, but actually a lot of opportunities to deal with the problem lie in this land use, agriculture, and forestry sector. The book tries to present an overall picture of how does it all fit together, basically arguing that you need all of the opportunities, all of the options, if you really want to control climate change. It's not a matter of saying, I like this, I don't like that. It's get everything you can get to do it. And then in the last part, it talks about a very fundamental issue, and that is how to make it happen. I mean, the message from basically the more technical and economic assessment is that's all possible, technically, economically, yes, but the real challenge is how to get it done. Where are the incentives for the individual actors in society? How do you create effective policies? And that has both national as well as a very strong international component. So it tries to do that in a way that makes the IPCC material accessible, avoiding jargon as much as possible. And hopefully it helps people to get to see in a fairly objective manner, I think, what are the options. It doesn't try to advocate much. It shows what is realistic and what is not realistic. So now I could, of course, give you a whole talk about all of this, but that might be rather boring. So what I thought, well, let's take the recent events that are happening internationally, the Copenhagen meeting, and take it from there. So I will take you through a number of slides that sort of give an assessment of what Copenhagen delivered. And then from there, I go back into some of the issues to illustrate some of the key issues in getting to deal with climate change. So what did Copenhagen deliver? Several people have been there, I understand. Many of you have read about it. You can say, on the positive side, it reflected a huge increase of awareness and political attention. There was a massive presence there, but also a massive attention in the press. 45,000 people showing up in Copenhagen that could not even be accommodated there. More than 100 head of government showing up there. That was an unprecedented. So it really reflects that has really has received a lot of attention. But what it delivered is not much. It showed that it was basically an inability. There had been 2 years of negotiations leading up to Copenhagen that was not concluded, really. There was a really acrimonious process where countries accusing each other, walkouts of countries. There was a lot of drama and a lot of sort of accusations to each other. What did come out was a political declaration. So it was already clear before Copenhagen a real treaty wasn't possible. The 2 years of negotiations hadn't sort of narrowed sufficiently, but what was felt to be possible was kind of a political agreement on key elements so that the concluding negotiations after Copenhagen would be relatively easy. Now, what came out was a political declaration, and that was not even unanimous. It was a partial agreement by a good number of countries. It wasn't clear exactly how many. But it has no status, and it has become clear now recently, after Copenhagen, that most developing countries don't want to associate themselves with this. They don't want to have their signature on it. They basically say, well, it reflects a certain amount of consensus on a number of issues. It's a reflection, and it's an input into the continuing negotiations. That's it. So there is basically no status to this. It's not a question of implementing this accord because countries refuse. So it's there to serve at least a reflection of what happened. And there is important, of course, there was a decision to continue the negotiations, more or less in the same manner as was done in the past 2 years. Now, let's look a little bit more in detail what is in this accord, and what was then the partial agreement amongst countries. There is an important recognition that warming of the globe more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial is dangerous and should be avoided. And that in itself is quite a step, because a couple of years ago that would not have been imaginable. Only a few countries said so, and now it's the large majority. However, there's no translation of what that means, no numbers about emission reduction. There are some pledges on the table, and come back to that, that reflect a certain range. It's not going far enough. So what countries have said they're willing to do does not add up to something that leads to 2 degrees. And there's a range where lots of these things are conditional, meaning that it's not likely it's coming out at the top of the range. It's somewhere down there. And I must say, chances of staying below the 2 degrees on this basis, very, very low chance. And we're more or less on track to 3 to 4 degrees. So there was hope that, although currently pledges would be insufficient, that, say, in a couple of years when the economic crisis is over, countries would be becoming more positive and more. So there was the idea of a review mechanism in 2015, so the countries could upgrade their efforts. It even mentioned there that a lot of countries, particularly small island states, arguing for 1.5 degrees is the limit, not 2. 2 degrees is already too much, and it's true, there's a lot of risk involved. So, although they mentioned this, there is nothing was agreed about strengthening the actions. And actually, you could say this is probably not more than lip service to vulnerable developing countries. And so you don't increase the chance of keeping this temperature down by this kind of agreement. So there's a list of actions agreed, and now, say, recently 56 countries submitted their actions and their pledges, which is a good thing. But, of course, there are a lot of things not agreed. There's nothing agreed about common accounting rules. Nothing agreed about a surplus emission allowance that is sort of hanging over the market from Kyoto, from the Kyoto Protocol. There is no benchmark on what countries are supposed to do. So it is a very much a bottom-up, but a very weak thing. There are loopholes in potential. So by interpreting the rules about how you count your forest, by how you use offsets, you can sort of weaken your pledge significantly. So without strict and clear rules, you don't have much. There is the stressing of adaptation and the provision of about $30 billion over the 3-year period, part of which will go to adaptation, which is a good thing. It's a substantial increase. Unfortunately, given that this money has to come from more or less current budgets, there's a risk that it will be partially relabeled money that is already meant for development. So what you can say is that the vulnerable countries will get support, but at the same time, the climate problem itself is not sufficiently addressed. There is a statement in the Accord about 100 billion. The wording is interesting. It says, we support the goal to mobilize 100 billion. That's not really a commitment, right? That's a sort of an intention, and it's so vague that you can count almost anything under it. Nevertheless, that's there, but of course, there is nothing about how to deliver this money, no mechanisms to generate the necessary funding, no governance structure, and it remains to be seen how this ever will become operational. They established a Copenhagen Climate Fund, but that's about it. So it's related to this notion of big amounts of money, but nothing how to fill the fund, no governance. And again, this is very unclear whether that will materialize. So a couple of other things. There was an establishment of a so-called RED mechanism, stands for Reduced Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, where there is an increasing agreement that needs to be done. Money needs to be flowing to forest countries. Forest countries need to implement policies. But unfortunately, no details were established. And it's possible that some of this 30 billion will begin to flow through forest countries, but it's very unclear at the moment. There's a similar statement about establishing a technology mechanism, but that's a very empty statement, and there's in the negotiations a very tendency for a bureaucratic approach. And I think you have to say that this lacks the substance, even behind this text in the way people are talking about it, it lacks the substance to become an effective mechanism. There's a reference to market approaches, but and in the Kyoto Protocol there is the clean development mechanism, which is operational and needs to be expanded and reformed, but unfortunately nothing is there. And actually, what is maybe even worse, there is nothing in terms of agreement on hard caps of countries. And if you don't have hard caps, it's very difficult to see a market mechanism evolve. So that may be even the bigger problem, that the international carbon market is becoming a really uncertain thing. It's not clear whether that will survive. Last point, a reference to low emission pathways. In fact, a very important thing. I will come back to that later. But it's not developed to any kind of detail, nothing about how to implement these things. And this does give only a very limited sort of push towards a shift towards low carbon development, which I think is fundamental to solving this problem. And this international agreement failed to really give a push in that direction. Now, what they did, as I indicated, there were two decisions. I won't go into too much detail because this is a very confusing matter. The negotiation process is very complex. They're basically negotiating in two parallel tracks. One is based on the Kyoto Protocol, sort of an extension into the period after 2012, but only for developed countries. And the other negotiation is about all countries and what they ought to do after 2012 to come to grips with climate change. And the two processes are basically talking about the same thing. There's a very big struggle about what is the right outcome? Is it an extension of the Kyoto Protocol and something else? Or should it be one thing that makes it very clear what is expected from all countries? There are big differences of opinion about what is the right outcome. It is, in fact, an issue that has paralyzed a lot of the negotiations. So this is a very unclear situation. This is a process that hasn't worked over the past 2 years. So is this going to work over over this year to lead to a result in Mexico at the end of the year, which is the next sort of summit? Now, one more thing, and that is why. Why? In the title, you can see that I'm a bit biased. I would consider this a failure because it did not give us sufficient agreement to be confident that the problem will really be addressed. So what are the reasons behind it? I think there are four main things I have identified. One is that we're really seeing a shift in power. It's not only the US and certainly not other developed countries who are the real powers. It's now, there are a number of new kids on the block: China, India, South Africa, and Brazil. And that's not only happening in the climate negotiations. If you remember the trade negotiations, similar things happened there. Actually, I think you have to conclude that the real powers at this moment are not really eager to get an international binding agreement with ambitious reductions that you need. That's a bit sobering, but I'm afraid it is true for a variety of reasons. If you think about China, China may have three reasons not to be so keen to have an agreement now. One is no constraints on growth. Two is no trade sanctions. And when you enter part of an international agreement, you are more vulnerable to trade sanctions. Three, China may want to become the exporter of low-carbon technology, but it needs time to build that. And so, for the time being, not having an international agreement is not so bad. And there was actually a lot of influence of China and other big developing countries on how other developing countries behaved. I'm even using the word client states. Now, of course, that mechanism has been used by the traditional developed countries for a long time, but now we're seeing the new powers using the same tactics, same strategies. The UNFCCC process is very convoluted. I already showed you a little bit about these different two parallel tracks, which is a very complex thing. There's a couple of others. There's no trust in the chairs of the negotiating groups. They had very limited mandate. You see the big powers, China and Saudi Arabia, promising support to developing countries to help them you have a situation where no majority voting is possible because the OPEC countries have prevented such a rule to be implemented. So this is a very convoluted process. I think the US domestic situation has certainly contributed a lot to the failure. There is this uncertainty about whether or not there will be domestic legislation. That was uncertain in Copenhagen. It's become more uncertain after Copenhagen. And the countries, of course, know that. So there is this a kind of reaction. If we're not sure the US is going to come in a significant manner with reductions in money, why would we ever be interested in a treaty? In the US, there is a fixation on China. I think that has not worked very positively. In terms of the trade sanctions, for instance, there is a situation that US legislation going through Congress will have to have a trade sanction paragraph, and Chinese know that. And I think that is one of the reasons why China says, well, we're not so interested in a treaty with rules and monitoring and verification. There's another interesting aspect of the United States position. US is arguing legally binding treaty, but it wants exceptions for itself in terms of the rules to obey. Like, we are not going to accept rules that are set by the UN for how we have to count our forest, what kind of offsets we can accept in our own domestic system, etc. That is I don't really, it's very hard to understand why that happens, but it's the case. So Europe, last, is also to be blamed. It has zigzagged, I would say, on the question of the legal outcome. Is it a Kyoto Protocol extension or is it one protocol? The EU has gone back and forth. The EU has relied a lot on others to step in. The EU has said we're doing 20% reduction below 1990 anyway, but if others are doing similar things, we're willing to move to 30. And the funny thing is that many other countries, including the US and China, have never sort of argued along those lines. They have never said we're only doing something if others do that. They have said we do this and that's it. The US made itself very dependent. And let's face it, the EU is not up to this power play that has gone on where the big shots determine. The EU was basically told what the agreement was between the US, China, Brazil, and South Africa, and India, and then had to accept it. So that was a bit of a poor performance. Now, this might be a moment for you to react to this. Do you agree with this analysis? Do you share the analysis of what the causes are? Do you have very different ideas? I'd like to hear some reactions, and after that we'll go into some of the issues. Okay.
There seems to be no consensus that lowering carbon emissions has a timeline. There's no time urgency that's apparent here. And I kind of wonder what tea leaves they're reading. Additionally to just the temperature consequences, the acidification of the ocean looks like it could be a problem for the food chain long before the most serious impacts of warming occur.
If that's okay, I will defer that answering because that's one of the things I want to go into. So say, why is it so urgent to act and what kind of risks are we facing? So I'll come back to that. Yes?
I would be interested to hear from you on the EU lacked vision, seeing the EU rather also in the past as being a leading force when it comes to committing to emission caps. How do you think they could have played the power game you're missing?
Well, the EU is a rather, I believe you're coming from those parts of the world, so am I. it's a funny organization. It is fascinating to see that 27 countries can really work together and formulate common positions. But when it comes to the real critical issues, when it came to the end of Copenhagen, where a number of people were sitting around the table, it was Frau Merkel from Germany, it was President Sarkozy, it was Gordon Brown from the UK, and I would say they sit there for themselves, primarily. So it's at that, and you see that when it comes to big political issues, peace and war issues. I mean, at such occasions, the EU is not so effective. It has trouble really pushing through. There are lots of internal discussions. It takes forever to come to agreement, etc. I think that's inherent to what the EU has. It could have made itself less dependent. It could have moved more on a sort of a unilateral basis, like this is good for us, this is getting us a competitive advantage on low carbon technologies. If the EU would make itself less dependent, I think it would have been more effective. Yes?
You described the Copenhagen meeting as a failure. How would you describe previous meetings?
I would consider Kyoto a success. In the sense, given the setting, given what it was supposed to do, that was really a first step in really bringing emissions down. It was deliberately done through developed countries first and developing countries later. Unfortunately, the US stepped out, but the countries in the Kyoto Protocol are delivering what they said they would deliver. It's a drop in the bucket in terms of solving the problem. It did get things moving. It established interest. It established the carbon market, established domestic policies in a number of countries. In that respect, I would consider it a success. In the back?
Thank you. Lee Shipper from Greek Corp.
Lee Shipper, yes.
You said fixation on China. To what extent does the rest of the world fixed on the U.S., which sort of forces us to be some sort of first mover? If you accept the notion that we still haven't moved after the 1973 oil crisis, aren't the others going to be waiting a long time?
Yeah, there is certainly a fixation on the U.S. Now, there are some good grounds. I mean, country with 25% of the global emissions means something if you want to address this problem. You don't have the biggest polluter by now overtaken by China, but then you have a problem. So in that sense, it's a good reason to say, well, they have to be in. Second is there are competitiveness issues. In developed countries, in Europe, in Japan, there is nervousness to move ahead and become aggressive on reductions and face competition, their industries facing competition from US industries not having to do that. And that's a realistic thing. And there's hesitation to use sort of border tax adjustments or other trade measures to protect industry. So I think that's a real thing, which limits how countries move without the US. It would be refreshing probably if countries would say, well, let's forget the US for now and let's move on, but I think that's not happening. Maybe two questions and then I'd like to move on. Sorry, and a third. Yes, can you keep it short?
Sure. So the US and John Pershing, for example, have suggested that they agree the UNFCCC process was ineffective, and have suggested that perhaps over the next year, negotiations will take place outside of that context.
If you allow me, I'll come back to that point later. Or say, what does this mean for the follow-up? Yes, yes, and then.
It seemed like there was kind of a media breakdown in presenting Copenhagen to at least the United States. I'm not sure what it was like in Europe, but do you think that if more people were brought into the theater, I guess, of what's really going on behind the scenes, do you think that would cloud the issue, kind of like it did with healthcare, or do you think it would actually build consensus and solidify a base behind it?
Well, I think it's always good to know what's happening. I mean, to inform people and to make them aware of what's happening, what really is happening, also in terms of what they can expect to happen next. I mean, if you understand the fundamental forces that prevented Copenhagen to become a success, I think you are better equipped to have a rational and develop a good strategy on how to move on. Communication, not just on these events, but also on climate change as such, on the problem itself, is very problematic, as we see these days with attacks on the IPCC and media following that slavishly, the public getting confused. It's a very big problem, really. Sure.
I want to disagree with you about Copenhagen. I think you're much too pessimistic. I think it's very positive. Look at what came out of it. You had the big developing countries admit for the first time that they have to do something. In Kyoto, they said industrialized countries should do it all. Now, at least, they had said, we have to do something. We're not going to tell you what it is. We're not going to tell you when it is. But at least we now know that we have to be in the club. The Europeans got their 2-degree thing. I never thought that made much sense, but you Europeans have the 2-degree business. The poorest countries have a promise of money. That's what they wanted, and they're going to get that. The original Kyoto Protocol talked about binding commitments. Nobody knew how to make the reductions they talked about in those binding commitments. And if you look at the outcome of Copenhagen, it's moving in a somewhat different direction, and a direction that I think may give you a chance to do something. 30 countries are responsible for 90% of the emissions. You really need to know what those 30 countries can do, and what 177 want to do is almost irrelevant. So I think this is a start on a positive road, and I think you're being much too negative.
If this was a problem we had time to solve, I would agree with you. But we don't have the time. I'll show you. This whole notion of 2 degrees comes from a risk basis, where sort of what kind of risk is acceptable. This is what IPCC did in the fourth assessment report. This comes from Steve Snyder, by the way. And if you see what happens at 2 degrees, you see that the risk is now seen to be much bigger on a number of, say, categories of risk. So that's one. Let me skip this. If you want to keep, this is temperature, equilibrium, this is concentration, stable concentration of greenhouse gases in a stabilization situation. If you want to stay below 2 degrees, it means you can't go much further than 450 ppm CO2 equivalent. And what does that mean in terms of emissions? It means your emissions, look at the green band, emissions can go up a little and have to go down. So look a little bit more in detail. If you want to stay in this green band, which gets you a reasonable degree of keeping below 2 degrees, the peaking of CO2 needs to be before 2015. For all gases, it's more or less 2020. That's the key point. Given the fact that gases in the atmosphere are disappearing very, very slowly, if you're not reaching that point of peaking, you're going to miss this 2 degree. To show what it means, if you would say by 2030 we can reach that point, you're basically committed to 3 degrees. That's the problem with climate change. in order to avoid long-term consequences, we have to do fast action in the short term. And that's why the speed at which issues are tackled is so critical. And if we are, for one reason or another, are not able to do that, we have to face the consequences. That's why I think Copenhagen doesn't deliver something that is consistent with the 2 degrees. It does not deliver this peaking at all, no way. And although there are positive things, it doesn't add up. If you look at the pledges made, this is another way of showing the same thing. Say this is business as usual. This is the trajectory you need to get on in order to be on track to 2 degrees. This is the band of pledges on the table right now. So in the best possible case, we're falling significantly short of what is necessary. It's likely we'll end up at least somewhere in the middle, and it's even further away. So looking at the trajectories, and we need to follow the red trajectory towards 2050. We're getting into the blue, or even worse than that. So that is, again, I use that as the context to judge whether Copenhagen was a success or not. And in that respect, I think you have to say it falls dramatically short. Let me show you a little bit about China. You said, well, developing countries have stepped up to the plate. They have now said we're going to take action, which is absolutely positive. This, in the bottom here, you see, compared to what business as usual is, that is this line, what the pledges put on the table by countries mean. And you see here Brazil, which is doing a lot better than business as usual. You see Indonesia doing a lot better than business as usual. You do see South Africa and Korea doing better than business as usual. But you see China and India, basically with what they put on the table, not much more than business as usual. Doesn't mean there's no action. There's lots of action. But given the situation in China, actually they could do a lot more. And for solving the global problem, that's very, very essential. They put on the table this 40 to 45% carbon intensity reduction pledge. Well, that's what it means. That's business as usual. It looks good. I was in a booth in Copenhagen next to the Chinese pavilion, and they had presentations all the time, and I heard them say, and in one occasion, that we are doing 45%, and the EU only does 20%. Now, I hope you realize they talk about carbon intensity and the EU about net reductions below 2020, below 1990. These are incomparable things. Under the Bush administration, there was a pledge to do 18% carbon intensity improvement. It was just not more than business as usual. And so this is very difficult to understand for people, but I think that was really something the Chinese did in terms of, okay, you want a target, you get a target. But it wasn't meaning much. Any comments on this? Questions?
Well, one thing I can't help but think about in your presentation here is that these are countries that are representing people and industries, largely, emphasis on industries. Isn't it true to say that financial situations in these countries is really driving policy?
Yeah, I mean, if you, and actually I come to this in a minute. In order to solve this problem, you need action around the world. You need aggressive action in developed countries. You need a lot of action in developing countries, assisted by developed countries' money and technical support, money in particular. And only then you can deliver the reductions. And of course, the economic recession and the budget deficits are not exactly the right situation to put large amount of money on the table. So that is certainly a problem. Now, they've tried to solve that in Copenhagen by doing it sort of step by step, by saying, okay, we promise a reasonable amount in the short term, and then we build from there.
Well, let me be a little more clear. Even in this country, what we've seen is that industries have passed dispersions on the scientific data in such a way as to actually reduce the priority politically of global warming.
Yeah, well, that I think is a different mechanism. I mean, the problem hasn't become smaller. On the contrary, what we know is the problem is, compared to what we thought 5 years ago, is bigger. The willingness to solve it seems to be affected, and I can understand that. These are political decisions, and people are arguing like this is not exactly the right thing to increase the cost of doing business if we want to survive this economic crisis. But that's all very short-term thinking. And then if you take a little longer-term vision, then you have to accept that muddling through in the old way is not going to do the job. And it's much better for everyone to shift in a different direction. Yes?
Is there any facilitation to aid these negotiations, or it's just each group speaking for itself?
Well, it is organized in groups. So normally you've got the EU, you have developing countries either operating as one big group or operating in regional groups. You've got the US and Japan and Australia trying to harmonize their views. So they try to make it more manageable. OPEC as a group, etc. Nevertheless, within these groups, there are normally all sorts of different opinions and interests. So that's not always possible to solve things in that way.
But frequently in corporate negotiations, they have a third party that helps sort of level the playing field of language to get the message.
Well, they do appoint chairs of these negotiating groups. And sometimes, I mean, when I was part of the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, there was a very sort of heavy-handed Argentinian ambassador, and he was the chair of the negotiating group, and he was willing to go through walls. There was a weak Japanese presidency, so he wasn't really hampered by that, and he got the result. This time, we had two groups with two relatively weak chairs, which were not given much mandate and were not the type, not the personality. So this time we had a Danish presidency who wanted to solve the problem. We had a secretariat that wanted to solve the problem. So in that circumstance, that certainly contributed to the lack of success. But so these things matter. It's not a formal independent mediator, but it's people from within, from the countries participating. Yes, one more question.
So I think I agree with your premise that the UN process seems to be at best stalled. If you were advising, say, Obama or Merkel or whomever, what would you advise them to do to take its place?
If you allow me, I'll come to that. I want to discuss a little bit the issue of the development context, because I think that may be the key to unlocking this current situation. So let me give you a few things on that. This is a simple diagram to show the relationship between development, socioeconomic development, and climate change. It creates the problem through emissions, climate change, and then it is the recipient of the results, the impacts of climate change. Now you can say, okay, mitigation means I reduce the emissions. I can adapt by reducing the impact of climate change on systems and the impact of systems on society. But if this development drives you into a high carbon world, which, let's face it, that's what's happening now, then trying to stop that by some mitigation, adaptation actions is not really working. You really need to look fundamentally at the driving forces here. And so if you can change this, you have a much better chance to solve the problem. And actually, this is a projection of expected temperatures in the next in this century, based on IPCC work. If you look at on this side, this is the full range given the different scenarios. Can go from sort of 1 point something to 6 point something degrees Celsius. These are, in fact, these scenarios reflect different kinds of societies, different kinds of development paths. A high carbon path, a low carbon path. So there's no action here, no policy. This is just the impact of different preferences in socioeconomic development. This is the big thing, really. And if you do a longer term analysis, this is coming from the Stern report that did the economic analysis, and you look at two different options. One where you do aggressive mitigation and you try and minimize the problem, gets you this sort of economic, without mitigation gives you this, because later on the impacts begin to affect economic growth. The path with mitigation gives you a lower economic growth initially, but in the end you're much better off. And so the analysis is it's better for countries if they take a longer term view to aggressively solve the problem than to accept the impacts and adapt to it. Now, one important instrument in doing that for countries is what we've started to call low carbon growth plans. It means countries can try and chart a course and say, look, what are our development interests? And how can we pursue them in a way that minimizes the emissions going along with that? And how can we, at the same time, improve our resilience, reduce our vulnerability to climate change? And if countries do that, and they look at development as the primary objective, and mainstreaming and integrating mitigation and adaptation, and if they take a long and a short-term vision, they can chart sort of strategies to make a transition from the current course to a low-carbon economy. And that is, I think, a very powerful instrument. You see a number of countries doing that now. Korea and Mexico are the two very good examples. Other countries are starting. Indonesia is doing it. Guyana is doing it. Brazil is starting to do it. So that is sort of a changing the paradigm from where we are now to where we need to go. I'll skip this for now. And go to the last point, actually. So what if we sort of try and see the situation, knowing what is needed to solve the problem, knowing what happened in Copenhagen, knowing the forces that prevented that to be a success, what does that mean for the future? First thing we have to accept, I think, is that it is now unclear, given what happened, how the UNFCCC process, as we know it, and has operated in the last 2 years, how that can deliver a very good outcome in Mexico. Basically, the fundamental forces haven't changed. And so without real changes in the process and real new political input, there's very slim chance this will deliver. So the idea is, well, we failed in Copenhagen, but we're going to make up and make a good agreement in Mexico. I think that's not very realistic. There is a tendency to say, well, we could do, there was one question on that, we can go into smaller groups and work out deals. We had actually those fora. We had the so-called Major Economies Forum, which were the 20 biggest emitters in the world. In fact, also the 20 biggest economies. We had the G20, now sort of replacing the G8 as the major forum for political decisions. Those things were useful. There were people talking to each other, and that was useful, but it never really led to any agreement. China, India, Brazil, South Africa have said, we don't want anything else than negotiating in the UNFCCC. So they've now already said, this is not for us, it's not the forum where we are willing to do business. So you could say, well, what then? And I think there's some good opportunities in sort of groups of like-minded countries. We have a number of countries interested in reducing deforestation, both forested countries as well as donors. There's a good chance they could work out something. You could imagine as a separate agreement, either formal or informal, to do the kind of things that really make difference on the ground. You could foresee that for this $30 billion that was promised in so-called fast start funding. Countries can start to discuss between donors and recipient countries, how can we most effectively implement that? On technology, there are a number of issues that are basically ripe. R&D increase, joint demonstration programs, innovation centers in developing countries to help them use the new technologies, and probably also some degree of policy coordination. If countries are doing things, and you can see that countries are willing to do things, they may benefit from some coordination in terms of how they are going to do that. But there's another level, and that may be actually the most important for the near future, and that is national actions. I mean, let's face it, this international negotiations are not a magical moment when countries suddenly absorb and accept to do things which they haven't really exercised through at home. It's always the conditions at home, the possibilities they see, the implementation they have thought through, that has to be there first before they're willing to accept to sign up to an international thing. So that remains the basis. And if countries shift towards thinking in terms of self-interest, thinking in terms of how to avoid future problems with climate, how to exploit opportunities, I think that is probably the most important thing. And that means that actually a paradigm shift in countries towards getting prosperity through a low-carbon pathway, that's probably the most fundamental. If that could happen, we would unlock a lot of very complex international negotiations because we get a different kind of negotiation. And it's as if Copenhagen came too early. This has not materialized sufficiently. There's no critical mass of countries yet that strongly believe this is true. If that happens, I think we're in a much better situation. Unfortunately, that probably is going to take a little longer than just this year. Let me wrap up here. I have addressed only a few things, and I hope you've risen your interest in reading more in the book. Thank you very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.